A 9-year-old boy stands in the Mongolian steppe, watching his father die from poison. Within days, his own clan, the people who were supposed to protect him, abandon his family in the wilderness to starve. For years, this boy survives on roots and fish, hunted by rival clans, at one point literally captured and forced to wear a wooden slave collar around his neck. That boy's name was Temujin. You know him by a different name, the name he would earn decades later after he'd been betrayed, enslaved, hunted, and left for dead more times than history bothered to count. A name that would come to mean, quite literally, universal ruler, Genghis Khan. By the time he died, he commanded an empire stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the Adriatic Sea, the largest contiguous land empire ever assembled by a single human being. And he built it from absolutely nothing. No throne, no inheritance, no army, just a wooden collar, a grudge, and one of the most ruthless political minds in human history. This is how a starving outcast conquered half the known world. To understand Genghis Khan, you first need to understand the world he was born into, because it was a world where betrayal wasn't the exception. It was the operating system. Mongolia in the 12th century wasn't a nation. It was a patchwork of nomadic tribes and clans. Mongols, Tatars, Karats, Merkits, Naimans, locked in an endless cycle of raiding, feuding, and shifting alliances. Loyalty lasted exactly as long as it was convenient. Blood feuds could smolder for generations. And to the south, the great settled empire of Jin Dynasty China watched all of this with a very deliberate strategy. Keep the nomads divided, keep them fighting each other, and never let any single tribe grow powerful enough to threaten the border. It was, in effect, a very old and very brutal game of divide and conquer, played not by the nomads, but on them. Temujin's own father, a minor chieftain named Yesugei, was a product of this world. Years before Temujin's birth, Yesugei had abducted a woman named Hulun from a Merkit tribesman and made her his wife. That single act of theft would come back to haunt his son in ways nobody could have predicted. And according to legend, and this detail alone tells you how the Mongols themselves wanted this story remembered, Temujin was said to have been born clutching a clot of blood in his tiny fist. His people believed their very first ancestor had been a gray wolf, born with a destiny from heaven on high. From the moment of his birth, in other words, his own people were already writing him into a myth. When Temujin was around 9 years old, his father Yesugei was traveling through Tatar territory, the same tribe his clan had been feuding with for generations, and following custom, sat down to share a meal with them. The Tatars recognized him, and in a quiet act of long-simmering revenge, they poisoned his food. Yesugei made it home before he died. His final act was to send for his young son so the family could say goodbye. Here's the part that should have ended this story before it even began. The moment Yesugei was in the ground, his own clan, the Taichut family, who had been his rivals, decided that a widow and her small children weren't worth protecting. They abandoned them, simply rode away and left Hulun and her children alone on the steppe with no protection, no herds, no status. For the next several years, the family that would one day rule half the known world survived on wild roots, fish, and whatever scraps the land offered. A brutal come-down from the normal nomadic diet of mutton and mare's milk that defined status on the steppe. And then it got worse. The Taichut, apparently still uneasy about the boy Temujin growing into a potential threat, hunted him down and captured him. They didn't kill him. They humiliated him instead, forcing him to wear a heavy wooden collar, essentially a portable set of stocks, and paraded him between their camps as a captive. One night, during a Taichut feast, Temujin noticed his guard had gotten careless. He swung the wooden collar like a club, knocked the man unconscious, and ran. The entire camp searched for him through the night. At one point, a Taichut tribesman actually spotted him hiding, and instead of turning him in, something about the look in the boy's eyes stopped him. He helped Temujin escape instead, at the risk of his own life. That detail matters, because it's the first documented instance of something that would define Temujin's entire life, an almost supernatural ability to make people choose him, even against their own self-interest. Not long after, horse thieves struck the family's camp and stole 8 of their 9 remaining horses. For a family this poor, a genuinely catastrophic loss. Temujin set out alone to track them down. Along the way, he stopped to ask a young stranger named Boorchu if he'd seen the horses pass by. Boorchu didn't hesitate. He dropped what he was doing, mid-chore, milking his animals, grabbed a fresh horse, and rode off with a total stranger to help recover the stolen herd. When it was over, Temujin offered him a reward, but Boorchu refused it. He recognized something in this teenage boy worth following, and he attached himself to Temujin for life, abandoning his own family to become what the Mongols called a nukur, a free companion, bound not by blood, but by personal loyalty. Boorchu would go on to become one of Genghis Khan's most trusted generals. And the pattern set here, total strangers choosing to follow Temujin over their own kin, would repeat itself again and again as his power grew. As a teenager, Temujin claimed Berta, the woman his father had betrothed him to before his death. But the Merkit tribe, the same people Yesigay had once stolen a wife from, still held a grudge. In a brutal act of tribal payback, Merkit raiders abducted Berta. This is the moment Temujin made his first real political move. He turned to Togrul, Khan of the powerful Kharit tribe, who had once sworn a brotherhood pact with his late father. Temujin had almost nothing to offer, just a single sable skin, ironically a gift he'd originally received as part of his own wedding. He gave it to Togrul anyway, invoking the old bond with his father. It worked. Togrul didn't just help. He committed a reported 20,000 men to the cause and convinced Jamuka, a friend from Temujin's childhood, to bring an army as well. For a penniless outcast who'd been living on roots a few years earlier, this alliance was a staggering reversal of fortune. The Merkit were crushed, and Berta was recovered. But this campaign revealed something about Temujin that would define the rest of his career. A ruthless, almost obsessive strategic principle. Never leave an enemy standing behind you. Every victory from this point forward wasn't just about winning. It was about permanently eliminating the possibility of future betrayal. What follows is one of the most calculated campaigns of internal consolidation in nomadic history. When the Yurkin clan, nominal allies, took advantage of Temujin's absence to raid his own camp, he didn't just punish them. He wiped out their entire noble line and absorbed their common people directly into his own forces as soldiers and servants. When he finally moved against the Tatars, the tribe that had poisoned his father, he didn't stop at victory. According to the secret history of the Mongols, he ordered the execution of every male Tatar taller than the height of a cart axle, a brutal but calculated measure meant to eliminate an entire generation of potential avengers, while allowing the youngest children to be absorbed and raised as Mongols with no memory of their old identity. This wasn't senseless cruelty for its own sake, though it was undeniably brutal by any modern standard. It was, according to most historians, a deliberate strategy. Destroy the old tribal aristocracies who might rally resistance, absorb their populations directly as loyal manpower, and dissolve the ancient clan loyalties that had kept the steppe permanently fractured for centuries. Even his old ally Togrul eventually turned against him, manipulated by both Yamuka's scheming and his own son's suspicions. Temujin defeated the Kharit as well, absorbing them exactly as he had the others. And then there was Jamuka, the childhood friend who'd once brought an army to save Temujin's kidnapped wife. Their friendship collapsed after a strange, cryptic exchange during a group migration, recorded so ambiguously in the secret history that historians still debate exactly what happened. What we do know is that Temujin's own wife, Berta, urged him it was time the two men parted ways, and shortly after, many of Jamuka's own men abandoned him to join Temujin instead, apparently sensing which man was actually going to win. Jamuka became the last real rival standing, eventually rallying a coalition and getting himself proclaimed a rival, Gur Khan, Supreme Khan. It didn't matter. One by one, every coalition Jamuka assembled was broken. The final blow came against the powerful Naiman tribe in the west, the last major power on the steppe. And even then, Jamuka abandoned his own allies at the last possible moment, true to the pattern of his entire life. By 1206, Temujin had no rivals left. In 1206, on the banks of the river Onon, a great assembly of steppe leaders formally proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, universal ruler. This single year reshaped world history more than almost any other date most people have never heard of. For the first time, Mongolia wasn't a shifting patchwork of hostile tribes. It was one unified nation, and it was built entirely around a war machine. Genghis Khan restructured his entire society along military lines, organizing his forces using a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, with iron discipline and loyalty owed directly to him, not to old clan chieftains. His generals weren't hereditary nobles. They were his own sons, or men he had personally chosen for talent and loyalty, regardless of their birth. Early Mongol armies were pure cavalry, riding hardy grass-fed ponies that needed almost no logistical support, an enormous advantage over the supply-heavy armies of settled kingdoms. But cavalry alone couldn't take walled cities, so the Mongols adapted, learning siege warfare from captured engineers and advisors, catapults, mangonels, burning oil, even the deliberate diversion of entire rivers to flood fortified cities into submission. Genghis Khan himself was, by most accounts, illiterate for much of his early life. It was actually a captured minister from the defeated Naiman tribe who introduced him to the value of a written script, which the Mongols adapted for their own language for the first time. Genghis Khan didn't resist this kind of foreign knowledge. He absorbed it, the same way he absorbed defeated tribes into his army. With Mongolia unified, Genghis Khan turned outward, and his first major target was the Tangut Kingdom of Sixia, a buffer state on China's northwestern border, which he subdued to secure his flank. Then, in 1211, he turned his full force against the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China, an empire that had spent generations manipulating and looking down on the nomads beyond its borders. In 1214, the Jin temporarily bought him off with a massive tribute of treasure. It didn't last. By 1215, the Mongols had taken Beijing itself, rather than personally overseeing the slow conquest of the rest of northern China. Genghis Khan handed that grinding, methodical campaign to one of his most capable generals, a man named Mukhali, while he turned his own attention westward, toward a war that would define his legacy far more than anything he'd done in China. The Khwarizm Empire, stretching across modern-day Central Asia and Persia, was a massive Muslim empire, and initially, Genghis Khan had no interest in fighting it. He wanted trade, not war. Then the governor of the border city of Otrar made a catastrophic mistake. He massacred an entire caravan of merchants traveling under Genghis Khan's personal protection. Several hundred people, by most accounts. When Genghis Khan sent envoys demanding justice, the Khwarizm Shah had them killed too, or, in some accounts, humiliated and sent back mutilated. This was, in the Mongol worldview, an unforgivable violation of both trade and honor. And what followed was a campaign of such calculated devastation that it permanently defined the Mongols' reputation in the Western and Islamic historical imagination. City after city across Central Asia was stormed. Populations were massacred or forced in horrifying fashion to serve as human shields and advance troops against their own countrymen in the next siege. Irrigation systems that had taken generations to build were deliberately destroyed, transforming fertile farmland back into desert, a scar in the region's agriculture that some historians argue took centuries to fully recover from. One especially chilling detail: even cities that surrendered promptly weren't guaranteed safety. At the city of Balkh, in what's now Afghanistan, the population was slaughtered anyway, for purely tactical reasons. A calculated message to every other city watching that surrender offered no real protection once you'd drawn Genghis Khan's anger. Contemporary chroniclers, writing from the safety of distance, describe the Mongols in almost apocalyptic terms. One medieval European writer called them a detestable nation of Satan, a deliberate pun linking the tribal name Tatar with the classical word for hell itself, Tartarus. That kind of language tells you less about the Mongols' actual numbers and more about the sheer, civilization-shaking terror they inspired in everyone who heard what was happening, even secondhand. Genghis Khan withdrew from Central Asia in 1223, his vengeance against Khwarizm complete. He wouldn't lead troops into battle again until 1226, in a final campaign back against the Tangut of Sixia, the same kingdom he'd subdued decades earlier, who had since rebelled. He died during this campaign on August 18, 1227. But here's what separates Genghis Khan from countless other brutal conquerors history has forgotten. He didn't just destroy. He built something meant to outlast him. He carefully chose his son Ogode as successor, secured the loyalty of his other sons to that choice, while he was still alive to enforce it, and left behind a functioning state and a battle-hardened army rather than a power vacuum. Those who knew him described a man of genuine complexity, not simply a mindless butcher, but someone with real strategic patience, someone willing to take advice from generals, from his mother, even from his wife Berta. He was famously loyal to those who earned his trust, and just as famously merciless toward anyone who broke faith with him, including, ironically, enemies who betrayed their own masters to help him, whose treachery he was happy to exploit but never truly respected. His reputation eventually grew so vast that an elderly Chinese Taoist sage named Changchun made the extraordinary journey across the length of Asia just to discuss matters of religion and philosophy with him in person. By the time he died, Genghis Khan's empire stretched from Beijing to the Caspian Sea, and his generals had already pushed raiding parties as far as Persia and Russia. He hadn't fully welded his conquests into a single, tightly administered empire. That work would be finished by his descendants over the following decades, expanding even further until the Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. Genghis Khan is remembered, understandably, as one of history's great destroyers. And the devastation he caused across Asia and the Islamic world was very real, very deliberate, and left scars that lasted for generations. But underneath the terror is a story almost nobody expects. A 9-year-old boy who lost his father to poison, was abandoned by his own people, wore a slave's wooden collar around his neck, and somehow, through sheer force of will and an unmatched understanding of loyalty and betrayal, built the largest land empire in human history from absolutely nothing. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe. I'm covering more of history's most unexpected rises to power soon. And let me know in the comments, whose rise to power should I cover next?